In Wisconsin, we have had vastly disproportionate incarceration of African Americans for decades. And by that, I mean that African Americans have been present in our prison population at a rate that is much higher than their proportion of the general population. The most recent data has African Americans at about 40% of the state prison population, but about 6 or 7% of the general population in the state. This kind of disparity has existed for a long time. I've looked back as far as the 1950s in my research and have found this overrepresentation of African Americans to be a constant. And that's fascinating and troubling because it shows that this disproportionate representation existed long before current sentencing policies existed, long before truth in sentencing, long before 3 strikes and you're out, long before the war on drugs. This historical perspective suggests that the problem of racial disparities is very deeply rooted in the criminal justice system, and that simply changing some criminal justice policies like sentencing laws may not be enough to change the racial disparity problem. In Wisconsin, we had a very stable prison population for many years in the middle of the 20th century. And then abruptly, in the early 1970s, the prison population took off, increased every year for about 3 decades in a row, and finally reached a peak about 23,000 about 12 years ago. That number is 9 times higher than what the previous equilibrium had been in the 60s and early 1970s. So this is explosive growth in imprisonment. This is similar to what happened in most other states across the country, but not in all other states. And there is a fascinating and important comparison that can be made between Wisconsin and Minnesota. Minnesota's prison population also began to rise in the 1970s, but rose at a much slower pace than Wisconsin's. Over the last 20 or 30 years, Wisconsin has had an imprisonment rate that's about twice as high as Minnesota's, yet the crime rates for the 2 states are almost exactly the same and have been on a long-term basis. So it's hard to see that Wisconsin is getting a large public safety benefit in return for having a much larger prison population and spending much more money on corrections. The incarceration rate in Wisconsin and nationally rose for a variety of reasons, and it's a complex phenomenon. Initially, a lot of what drove the increase in imprisonment was an increase in crime, and there were some very significant increases in violent crime in particular in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. But beginning in the early 1990s, crime rates stabilized, and yet the imprisonment rate continued to skyrocket for another 10 or 15 years after crime rates flattened out. And so that's an indication that in that time period, primarily in the 1990s and early 2000s, the criminal justice system got a lot tougher. And in Wisconsin, a significant part of that story was the elimination of discretionary parole and the adoption of truth in sentencing. Another important part of what happened in the 1990s was a big escalation in the war on drugs and a decision made in Milwaukee County in particular to ensure some time behind bars for all drug trafficking offenses, even relatively minor drug trafficking offenses. Another important part of this mass incarceration story has been revocations from probation and parole and extended supervision. So more and more people have been sent to prison through this backdoor route to imprisonment based on having violated conditions of release in the community. Often these violations are technical violations and are not the commission of new crimes.